Have you ever been judged just by your appearance? One moment, Matthew Grant was just another passenger, like everyone else. The next moment, he was seen as a suspicious character. But this officer had picked the wrong person to mess with. Imagine stepping off a long flight, exhausted but relieved to finally be home, only to realize you're being watched. No reason, no explanation. Just a scrutinizing look, an unsolicited question, and suddenly you're the center of an unwanted confrontation. Will Matthew stay silent and accept it, or will he stand up against the injustice in front of everyone? What would you do if you were in this situation? Leave your thoughts below. Los Angeles International Airport is always bustling, a giant machine running non-stop. The overhead announcements echo down the hallways, passengers chatting, suitcase wheels clattering on the shiny tile floors. Among the hurried crowd, Matthew Grant stepped out of the gate from a flight coming in from Dallas, one hand pulling his suitcase, the other checking his phone. It had been a long, tiring flight, but he felt relief as he finally made it home. But then a discomfort crept over him, a gaze, an unblinking stare. He looked up and met the eyes of a security officer, Officer Daniel Hall. He was standing not far off, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Matthew. Not a casual glance, not a fleeting look. It was a purposeful stare. Matthew swallowed, trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But as he walked over to the baggage claim, the eyes stayed on him. Everyone else around him waited for their luggage, but only he was being watched. Not the middle-aged man checking his watch anxiously. Not the family with 3 kids laughing together. Not the young couple discussing dinner plans. Only him. Matthew tightened his grip on his suitcase. A question ran through his mind. What did I do to be followed like this? But he quickly realized, the real question was, am I going to let this continue? He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But just as he reached for his luggage, a deep, sharp voice cut through the busy noise. Sir, I need to see your ID. Matthew turned around and, as expected, Officer Daniel Hall was standing there. His face was stiff, his gaze unwavering. Matthew blinked, unable to hide his confusion. He looked around. No one else was being asked for identification. Not the middle-aged man, not the young woman pulling her suitcase past him. Just him. Is there a problem, officer? Matthew's voice remained calm, but inside a strange feeling began to rise. Hall crossed his arms, his face hard, unyielding. You match the description of an individual we're looking for. Matthew raised an eyebrow. What description? Hall paused for a second. A meaningful silence. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way, Hall said, his tone even, but with an underlying threat. Matthew narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I'm standing here like everyone else, waiting for my luggage. You say I match a description, so what is it? Can you be specific? Hall didn't respond immediately. His eyes were tense, as if he were weighing whether to keep pushing. But instead of explaining, he took a step forward, deliberately blocking Matthew's path. This isn't an interrogation. I asked for your ID. At that moment, Matthew sensed something different. It wasn't just suspicion. It was a test, an unspoken threat, a way to see if he would comply. But Matthew had never been the type to bow down easily. A sharp, decisive voice came from behind. Excuse me, officer, is there a problem here? Daniel Hall froze and turned around, while Matthew also looked toward the voice. A woman with confident posture, long black hair cascading over her shoulders, holding her phone up. Grace. Though Matthew didn't know her, one look was enough for him to realize she wasn't just a regular passenger. She stood straight, her gaze unwavering, and most importantly, she was filming. Daniel squinted, clearly uncomfortable with this sudden interruption. Ma'am, this is a law enforcement matter. I suggest you don't interfere. I just want to make sure everything is handled fairly, Grace replied, her voice calm but carrying weight. Matthew glanced at her for a moment. She didn't lower her phone. She didn't back down. And he understood that her presence right now was a shield. Daniel blinked, then turned back to Matthew. I'm doing my job. Then I'm sure you won't mind explaining why he's the only one being stopped? Grace stepped forward, her eyes sharp. I've been watching since the beginning. He's just waiting for his luggage like everyone else. But somehow, he's the only one being asked for ID. Some passengers started to take notice. A man nearby stopped, furrowing his brow. A woman pulled out her earbuds and glanced over. The atmosphere began to shift. Daniel clenched his jaw, clearly not wanting to be put in this situation. I don't need to explain every detail to you. But you do need to explain it to the law. Grace emphasized each word, her phone still recording. Matthew looked at her, for the first time feeling that he wasn't alone. The tension in the baggage claim area grew thick, like a guitar string stretched to its breaking point. A young man with earbuds silently pulled out his phone and started recording. An older woman nearby furrowed her brow, whispering something to her husband. An airport employee briefly paused in unloading luggage, casting a curious, uneasy glance toward them. Matthew could feel the pressure building in the air. Everything had been normal. A passenger waiting for luggage, a TSA officer patrolling. But now, the eyes around them were locked in, staring at something unusual. Daniel Hall realized it too. He shifted his stance, gripping the strap of his radio as if contemplating whether to call for backup. He hadn't expected this situation to draw so much attention. Can he get his luggage or not? A voice cut through the tension, not loud but enough to interrupt the atmosphere. A man in a white shirt, clearly an airport employee, looked directly at Daniel. His eyes weren't confrontational, just expectant, a kind of expectation Daniel couldn't easily ignore. Matthew stood still, his hands relaxed by his sides, but in his mind he was calculating. He had seen situations like this unfold before. Push it any further, and it could escalate into a real confrontation. Daniel furrowed his brow, glancing at the phone's recording. His lips pressed together. He realized a mistake right now could be more than just a minor argument. It could become tomorrow's headline. Daniel Hall tightened his grip on the strap of his radio, his eyes flashing with growing impatience. The situation was no longer simple. The stares around them had shifted from curiosity to scrutiny, but instead of stepping back, he decided to push even harder. Step back. Put your hands behind your back. His voice was firm, a command that left no room for defiance. Matthew stared straight at Daniel. He didn't move, his breathing slow, his hands still at his sides. He hadn't committed a crime. There was no reason for him to be treated this way. What am I being arrested for? His voice was calm but clear. Daniel hesitated just for a moment, but then he quickly masked his doubt. You're resisting an officer of the law. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some exchanged confused glances. A young man in a red hoodie whispered, "He hasn't even done anything." Then a voice rang out, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. Officer Hall, do you realize everything you're doing is being recorded? Daniel turned sharply. Grace was still there, her phone held up, the camera still running. I don't think you want your mistake to go viral on social media tonight. Daniel frowned. A moment of hesitation. The tension was reaching its peak. Everything was about to turn in one of two directions. Matthew said nothing. He didn't need to. For the first time in this confrontation, he saw the uncertainty in the officer's eyes. And he knew this psychological battle was about to shift. The atmosphere thickened. The tension shattered when a voice, not loud but with unmistakable authority, broke the silence. Officer Hall, what's going on here? Daniel jerked around. Thomas Scott, the airport security director, was approaching. He wasn't in a rush, but every step he took carried a weight that made Daniel instinctively step back. Things had just changed. Matthew stood his ground, unmoving, but now his gaze was directed toward Thomas. Grace didn't stop filming. Her phone still recorded every detail. Thomas quickly surveyed the scene. Passengers were watching. Security cameras were active. The crowd waited to see what would happen next. Is there a problem with this passenger? Thomas asked, his eyes locked on Daniel. Daniel swallowed hard. He matches the description of someone we're looking for. Thomas didn't blink. Really? What's that description? Silence stretched. Daniel had no answer. Thomas sighed, turning to Matthew. Mr. Grant, I apologize for the inconvenience. You're just waiting for your luggage, correct? Matthew nodded. Yes. Do you have your baggage claim receipt? Matthew pulled out his phone, scrolled down to the email, and showed the screen. Thomas glanced over. Everything was in order. He turned back to Daniel. "Did you request this information?" Daniel remained silent, because everyone knew the answer. The anger in Thomas's eyes sharpened. He knew exactly what this was, and it was about to end right here. The feeling of failure washed over Daniel like a cold wave, but he couldn't back down. Not in front of all the watching eyes. Not in front of Matthew Grant, who still stood there, eerily calm. Thomas Scott didn't say much. He just looked at the officer in front of him, his voice low but filled with authority. "Matthew Grant has not broken any rules. He can take his luggage and leave now." The crowd murmured softly, not in excitement, but because this moment carried more weight than any words could express. Daniel clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He had lost control of the situation, but back down? Number. He still had a chance to salvage it. "I'm just doing my job," Daniel said, his voice firm, trying to maintain whatever authority he had left. "No, you're not," Thomas replied, his gaze cutting through Daniel's fragile defense like a blade. The camera was still recording. The media was waiting. One more mistake, one weak excuse, and Daniel knew things would get worse. Matthew didn't need to say anything more. He simply grabbed his suitcase, casting a glance at Daniel. Not with anger, but with a bitter understanding. He had seen this before, and he knew it wouldn't be the last time. But this time the world was watching, and this time the truth had won. The first ping went off as Grace hit the upload button, a notification, then another, and within minutes the flood of outrage began to spread. "This is why we need to speak up," one user wrote, attaching the video Grace had just posted. In the video, Daniel Hall stood there, his eyes stiff as he was questioned. His voice was full of authority, but his gaze had lost the confidence it once held. The image of Matthew standing firm, resolute, refusing to be subdued by unjust power, became a symbol of what everyone had seen far too many times. But this time, it wouldn't be buried in silence. 10,000 views in the first 10 minutes, 50,000 views in 1 hour, 100,000 views before Daniel even had a chance to leave the airport. Comments flooded in. "How many times has he done this before? We need to take action. Does anyone have information on this officer? Clear evidence. Will anyone be held accountable?" Daniel realized things were spiraling out of control when his phone started buzzing with messages from colleagues. They had seen it too. Thomas Scott, the airport security director, had seen it, and he knew that now everything was no longer under Daniel's control. The public had spoken up, and this time, they wouldn't stay silent. The news spread like wildfire. Just hours after Grace's video became the focal point of online debate, the police department was forced to release an official statement. "Officer Daniel Hall has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his conduct at LAX airport." But Matthew didn't feel relieved. He had witnessed these scenarios too many times. An officer gets suspended, public outrage lasts for a few days, and when the storm dies down, everything goes back to normal. It wasn't the first time, and without enough pressure, it wouldn't be the last. Sitting in a cafe near his hotel, Matthew glanced down at his phone screen. Messages flooded in. "Thank you for standing up. I've been through something similar, but I didn't have anyone recording it. Don't let this be forgotten. Keep fighting." He sighed, the messages feeling like an invisible burden. He hadn't intended to become the center of a national debate. He just wanted to go home after a long flight. But that was the problem. Too many people just wanted to go home, but not everyone was as lucky as him. Grace sat across from him, watching him thoughtfully. "What are you going to do next?" Matthew looked up at her. A simple question, yet it carried so much weight. If he stayed silent, this story would fade into oblivion. If he spoke out, there would be consequences he couldn't predict. But did it really matter? Finally, he exhaled, picked up his phone, and began typing. "Suspension is not justice. This cannot end here." He hit the post button, and with that action, he knew the real battle had just begun. The sound of rapid typing filled the newsroom of the local newspaper. Investigative reporters didn't miss this opportunity. A police officer suspended for discriminatory behavior in public. This wasn't just ordinary news. It was the beginning of a deep investigation. And then they found what they had suspected all along. Daniel Hall's internal records were not a blank page. Instead, they were filled with black marks. 4 complaints of abuse of power, 2 incidents involving excessive use of force, 1 civil lawsuit settled quietly. They all had one thing in common. The victims often belonged to a certain group: people of color, immigrants, those he considered suspects simply because of their appearance. The media began reporting, first smaller news outlets, then bigger newspapers, and finally national TV stations started broadcasting the story. Is Officer Daniel Hall part of a systemic problem? Why are actions like this still being covered up? How many victims have not been heard? Public opinion erupted. Online discussions grew heated. Within 24 hours, the hashtag number Justice for All became the top trending topic. People who had faced similar situations began sharing their stories. Daniel Hall was no longer just an individual. He had become a symbol of a larger issue, a system that needed to change. Matthew read the news on his phone, unsurprised but still tense. He knew this would happen, and he also knew this wasn't over. Grace called him as soon as a major news outlet posted the latest update. They can't ignore this anymore. But they'll try. Matthew understood that. The system would do everything it could to protect itself, but this time, it seemed like the public wouldn't accept silence any longer. Then the next piece of news broke. Advocacy groups had submitted a petition for a comprehensive investigation into the law enforcement agencies at LAX. Several human rights organizations were planning to hold a press conference. The darkness that Daniel Hall had once hidden behind was now exposed in the light. And this time, it seemed like no one would let it be covered up again. Matthew sat in his apartment, the light from his phone screen reflecting off his face as he scrolled through the hundreds of comments pouring in. His story was no longer just his own. The news about the incident at the airport had spread like wildfire on social media. People who had experienced similar situations began to speak out, sharing moments when they were treated unfairly, unjustly suspected, or humiliated just because their appearance didn't fit some stereotype. He opened the post draft, his finger hovering over the keyboard. What should he say? A post expressing outrage? A general call for justice? Or something stronger? He took a deep breath and started typing. I didn't want to cause trouble that day. I just wanted to go home. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that moments like these are still happening every day to thousands of others. What matters is that, without someone recording it, without public attention, I might have become a statistic in some report, a forgotten incident. We can't keep pretending that awareness is enough. Knowing that this happens doesn't make it stop. Justice isn't given freely. It only comes when we force those in power to be held accountable. If you believe change is necessary, don't just share a post and forget about it. Speak up, ask questions, demand transparency. We are not passive witnesses in this world. We have the power to change it. He read over each word. No exaggeration, no anger, but there was a weight to each sentence. A call to action, not just to speak, but to act. He hit post. Within minutes, likes, comments, and shares began to multiply exponentially. People weren't just reading, they were reacting. His phone vibrated. A message from Grace. Your post is going viral. This could be the beginning of something bigger. Matthew stared at the screen. Bigger? He wasn't sure he wanted that. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't turn his back on it now. Matthew sat in front of his computer screen, the news about the incident still flooding social media and news broadcasts. His story was no longer just about him. It had become a wake-up call, a piece of a larger puzzle about justice and accountability in law enforcement. He scrolled through the comments. Some were supportive, with stories from people who had been treated unfairly just like him. But there were also opposing views, people trying to justify, finding ways to flip the narrative, as if this was just a misunderstanding, an isolated incident. But no, Matthew knew this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a system that had existed too long in irresponsibility, where abusers of power could act without fear of consequence, where victims like him were often forgotten when the public's attention cooled. He opened a new post draft, took a deep breath, and typed, If you think this doesn't concern you, think again. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be someone you love. Silence isn't safety. It's an invitation for this to continue happening. We can't let moments like this be buried in oblivion. Justice doesn't come from luck or fleeting attention. It comes from action, from pressure, from holding those in power accountable. If you see injustice, speak up. If you witness abuse of power, record it. If you can make a change, don't hesitate, because one day you might be the one who needs protection. He paused for a moment, rereading each line. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a declaration. He hit post. The phone buzzed immediately. A message from Grace. Your post is spreading even more now. This isn't just a story. It's becoming a movement. Matthew leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone screen. He hadn't planned for this, but now he couldn't turn his back on it. Because if he stayed silent, this would happen again. The lesson from this story wasn't just about a moment of injustice. It was a wake-up call about power, responsibility, and the voice of every individual in society. Abuse of power doesn't just exist when those in authority act wrongly. It exists when society chooses to turn a blind eye to those actions. If Grace hadn't recorded the incident, if no one around had raised their phones, if Matthew had stayed silent and obeyed the unreasonable orders, this story might have ended in a very different way. A conclusion where he was unjustly charged and pushed into a flawed legal system with no one speaking up to defend him. But instead of staying silent, speaking up changed the game. It didn't just help Matthew. It opened up a larger conversation about fairness, about the need for transparency and accountability in law enforcement. It showed that a small action, a video, a post could spread powerfully and create real pressure. This story also raised the question, how many others have gone through the same thing without anyone witnessing it? How many injustices have been buried simply because no one spoke up? Justice isn't something that's handed out. It must be fought for. And sometimes all it takes to change something wrong is one person refusing to stay silent.